Hello and welcome back to Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast that celebrates all things art historical with me, your host and resident art historian, Jo McLaughlin. Hello and welcome back. This week it is episode 66 and we are discussing all things Gustave Metzger. Now, Gustave Metzger was a German artist and political activist who developed the concept of audio destructive art and art strike. He's an exceptionally interesting artist and somebody that I'd never come across before. And I was reached out to by the wonderful Phil Barton, who himself is a British artist and is very much inspired by Gustave Metzger's way of creating, of thinking. And it's a really incredible conversation that Phil and I have. And I just have to thank Phil because I had no idea who Gustave was, his role in contemporary art history, and also his legacy that he has left behind as well. Gustave in 2015 put out a worldwide call for action to remember nature. And we discussed that a little bit in the podcast about what that is. But essentially, Gustave was a real trailblazer in terms of thinking about art as not only a political tool, but also using it as a way to discuss man's impact on nature. It was something that was really very passionate to the artist and something that was at the core of his work, his very, very punchy work as he moved through his life. It's a great conversation. You will definitely learn something, and I really hope you enjoy it. So sit back and relax as Phil and I discuss the wonderful Gustave Metzger. So I said this to you before we hit the record button, but Gustave Metzger, I had never heard of him, and I feel a bit ashamed that I haven't. What a really incredible, forward-thinking, just punchy, political, environmentally focused, driven artist. Really quite ahead of his time when you think about the type of work that he was doing in the 40s, 50s, well, his whole career. Where did you first come across him?
I first came across him without really realizing his significance when I saw Flailing Trees, which is one of his works, which was commissioned by Manchester International Festival and was in the Peace Garden outside the town hall, I think in about 2010, 11, 12, something like that. And then it moved to the Whitworth, which is just down the road from me. And I was really struck by it, but I saw the name, but it didn't mean anything to me. And then I was doing my foundation year in art, actually. I had a 35-year career in environmental regeneration, which came to an end, rather sorry end, with austerity, and it was a very painful time. And I decided that I would work on the same issues that I was working on in my previous career, but as an artist. And I was doing my foundation year in art when he died. He died in March 2017. And I read his obituary in The Guardian, and I thought, wow, and started to find out more about him. And one of his last works was to call for a day of action for all artists to remember nature. And he did that in 2015 and on the 4th of November. And on the 4th of November 2017, I organised a day of action to remember nature in Salford. And since then, every 2 years, I have organised a day of action to remember nature on the 4th of November. And as I started to read about him and see him, I came across his polemic called Damaged Nature, which he wrote in 1996. And for me, that's the focus of my work. But I think the focus on Metzger's work was all the time on authority and dictatorships and capitalism and the way in which organizations hold people back and potentially destroy them. But he then realized that the same was true of nature. And in the latter 20 years of his life, he focused very much on damaged nature as in his work. And really I think his passion, his formative period was, he was born in Nuremberg and he saw the Nazi rallies there as a child, and then he came to London just before the Second World War on the Kindertransport with his brother. The rest of his family didn't survive the Holocaust, although I think two sisters did. He found them again sort of like 10 years later in Sweden, I think. But basically, it must have been hugely traumatic for him. And he had seen the rallies, and therefore, unlike most of us, had seen, I suppose, dictatorship in all its sort of power and glory in the flesh, as it were. And I think that I know that drove his life thereafter. So he arrived here early in the war. He trained as an artist. I actually think he studied art just after the war in Antwerp. So he was in Holland briefly. And during the 50s, he worked in paint and drawing. And he found himself working or being taught by David Bromberg. And I think that was very fortuitous because Bromberg was a bit of an outsider. And he also, as well as painting and drawing as a way of seeing the world, he saw that art was an embodiment of social force and social use. And I think that maybe gave Metzger the confidence to sort of cross over art into his politics in a way that he might not otherwise. So he was with Bromberg, I think, for about 4 or 5, 6 years in the 50s, and then went off and did various other things for a little bit before coming back to London and getting stuck into what became his life's work.
Yeah, because his life work then became, because he invented a whole genre of art.
He did, yes. He invented auto-destructive art, and
which was a phrase, Phil, I must admit I had never heard.
I think it's a fantastic phrase, and it has its counterpart, which is auto-creative, which he came to as well, because he always felt that destruction had a creative, flip sides of a coin. He was, I think I should say that he was very, very heavily involved in the precursor to CND and the Committee of 100, Bertrand Russell's Committee of 100. He was a named member of that committee fighting against atomic bomb at the time, sort of shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, my mother, I remember telling me she didn't know whether they'd wake up the next morning when that was going on. And we were in Ghana, so a long way from Cuba. But, I think that was heavily around. And he was actually imprisoned. He went to court, refused to say that he wouldn't protest. And he told the court, "I came to this country from Germany when 12 years old. My parents disappeared in 1943, and I would have shared their fate. But the situation is now far more barbarous than Buchenwald, for there can be absolute obliteration at any moment. I have no other choice than to assert my right to live, and we have chosen in this committee a method of fighting which is the exact opposite of war, the principle of total non-violence." I think that sort of, in many ways, sums up where he came from, why he felt the way he did. But as I say, the auto-destruction had an auto-creative. So he was saying, actually, this is anti-war as strongly as you can do it by not being violent, sort of. So, but nonetheless, he spent several months in prison because he refused to be bound over to keep the peace. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's so interesting. I wonder if it's because of the word destructive, because this is something that threw me when I first started reading into him. I was waiting for these really quite violent protests or destruction of artworks, and it really isn't that.
So it isn't. It's sort of what he's saying is that we need to use the tools of technology and modern life and so on. And he at one point he said that sort of the most perfect artworks are now thrown out and left on the pavements of London. And what he was talking about was the packaging from goods, and even some of the fridges and things which were being, were so beautifully designed and elegant and all the rest of it, and they were seen as rubbish. And he developed this idea of auto-destructive art, and he published a number of manifestos. And about the same time he published the first one in 1961, he did a demonstration on the south banks of the Thames where he dressed up in a gas mask and total overalls and Wellingtons and all the rest of it. And he sprayed acid onto nylon sheets. And the acid caused the sheets to melt and make all sorts of different shapes as it sort of shrunk away and so on. And he said about that a piece of nylon was destroyed, but it created new vistas of St. Paul's Cathedral because you could see through it. You could see through it and so on. So, and it's very short. I'll just read his first manifesto, it was published in 1959, 4th of November again.
There you are.
Actually, to remember nature. 4th of November 1959, Autodestructive Art. Autodestructive art is primarily a form of public art for industrial societies. Self-destructive painting, sculpture, and construction is a total unity of idea, site, form, colour, method, and timing of the disintegrative process. Autodestructive art can be created with natural forces, traditional art techniques, and technological techniques. The amplified sound of the autodestructive process can be an element of the total conception. The artist may collaborate with scientists, engineers. Self-destructive art can be machine-produced and factory-assembled. Autodestructive paintings, sculptures, and constructions have a lifetime varying from a few moments to 20 years. When the disintegrative process is complete, the artwork is to be removed from the site and scrapped. And this idea that no artwork should last longer than 20 years, I think is such a powerful one. And what emerged alongside that was two other principles. The first one is that Metzger believed that the artist should start creating the artwork, but shouldn't complete it. It should be completed. The process of creation should continue once the artist sets it off, so that the artist avoids any ownership of the development of the process as it goes forward. And what he sees there is that, it can be created by nature, the weather, by it being dropped, smashed, whatever, but the artist has started it, set it up, but hasn't completed it. And then the third principle is that of participation. So the whole artwork should be a participative process. It should be made in public and it should not be displayed in private. And it is not to be consumed privately for a select group. And one of the other aspects of his practice and campaigning was a deep distrust of the art markets. And so this idea that artworks only last for 20 years is a really interesting one. And it's interesting that it coincided with the conceptual art movement, which for a period tried to stop having artworks that people could, because it was concepts, and once concepts have been conceived and put in the public domain, they can't be taken back. Although interestingly, that didn't last very long, and by the early 70s, the conceptual artists were selling their drawings and their preparatory work and all the rest of it. So, but it's very interesting. And later on, he was very much involved with others. He set up the Destruction in Art Symposium in 1966. It was a 3-day affair with lots of other events going on around it. And he had about 50 avant-garde artists from 10 countries taking part. And also he invited scientists, philosophers, psychoanalysts, technicians, computer scientists to link the theoretical issues of destruction with actual instances of destruction taking place in society. And in Science and Art, and Metzger said, the destruction taking place in society includes atmospheric pollution, creative vandalism, destruction in protest, planned obsolescence, popular media, urban sprawl, overcrowding, war, biology, economics, medicine, physics, psychology, sociology, and space research. So that's quite a list. But the point he's making, and even there you can see how he's going to go on to nature, is that we are destroying things. We think it's all progress and so on, but in our processes we are destroying. And I think that was very much central to his thinking. He was also a vegetarian most of his life. He was just very radical, and he didn't try to not be part of society. He engaged with it very actively, but he tried to draw attention to the downsides of how we organize ourselves and what we do through his writing and through his practice.
Yeah, I think he was just very good at holding a mirror up. He's not trying to fluff what's going on. He is just saying we're all part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution, which is
Yeah, and he said, I assert my right to live. It's sort of, we all have an agency. So
Yeah, I mean, a really powerful piece. Was it something that the work that you discussed in the South Bank Centre and his manifestos, and because he loved a manifesto, and the collection of artists and scientists that he brought together in 1960, I think it was 1966.
66, I think it was. Yeah, yeah.
And was this something that he continued to do on like a biannual basis, or was it just
No, he tended to. I think it's probably fair to say he tended to do one-offs. He did lots of teaching and he did lots of lecturing. I think not all the time, but in batches. But he continued. So when he called a 3-year art strike. He called on for all artists to go on strike. This was in the late 60s again, I think. And he was the only one who did it. But he went on strike for 3 years. And one of the interesting things is there was an exhibition organised at the ICA in London, and it was 6 contemporary German artists, and Joseph Beuys was there, and others, Richter, I think, but they all said you have to invite Metzger, and so it became. But Metzger said, "I can't. I'm on strike."
Mhm.
And so, but the compromise was that he agreed that he would visit the gallery and talk to the visitors. He wouldn't show any work. He wouldn't be in a catalogue. He wouldn't be named, but he would actually put in appearances and talk to whoever he found.
I love that though. I think it just shows that he had principles and he stuck to his guns. And when have you ever heard of an artist going on strike? That's incredible. Like,
So, so yeah. So then I suppose one really interesting, also in the late 60s, I think, 68, I think it was, for some reasons I'm not quite clear why, he got invited to Swansea University, and he ended up being given a chemical engineering lab, and he made an exhibition, an auto-destructive exhibition, out of the equipment. It had pieces like, they had a compressed air line, so he got a couple of hoses on this line, and just let the compressed air go through it. So they snaked about the place, sort of. And he had another one where he had a hot plate and water dripping onto it, and he set it up so that the water drop evaporated before it got to the hot plates. So you had this drop coming, and then it sort of shook and it never actually dropped, even though another drop then came. And then, so he just had this sort of hugely creative way of looking at scientific equipment and putting it to a completely different use, which I think is really lovely. And so that was several of those were recreated, as some of his other pieces have been recreated, including his acid on the sheet. But that one was recreated in Cambridge 2015, I think it was. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the gallery. It's a very famous one.
I've got Kessel's Yard, but I don't.
Kettle's
Yes,
Yard, that's where
amazing.
it was. Yeah, but he was always interested in the technology. For the first time, I saw liquid crystal environment, which is a very famous work of his. It was at the Barbican in they had a post-war modernist exhibition, and he had this piece. And basically it was a darkened room with screens and sort of old-fashioned heat-driven projectors, light bulb with giving off heat. And in front of it, he put very thin slides containing crystals in a liquid.
Hmm?
And as the bulb gave off the heat, it caused them all to move around. And because the bulb was shining light through them, the screens had these slowly moving, and it never repeated itself. And it was a classic. It was not going to last more than 20 years because, the bulb would go or whatever, it just wouldn't. He started it off, but nature and the heat completed it.
Yeah.
And he did it in public. So it was a classic piece of auto-destructive art, but it was actually destructive in the same sense it wasn't going to last, but it was hugely constructive, creative, because the result was very beautiful, sort of hypnotically beautiful. I sat in that room for I don't know how long in the dark, watching these screens sort of moving around just a couple of years ago. So
So I didn't see that exhibition, but I have seen photos, and I'll for anyone listening, I'll put those photos up online as well because they are exceptionally beautiful. They're completely mesmerizing.
Yeah, they are, and it's the way, if you can find some video, it's the way they just sort of move gently and swish around, sort of very, very slowly and deliberately as the sort of. And then I'm sure I'm leaving up things out, but the things I know about, he did a really interesting series of photographs. So he called them historic photographs. And basically he took really famous photographs of things like the Warsaw Ghetto being cleared and one of Hitler in a car being driven and so on. And he basically partially or wholly hid them from view. So in order to see them, you had to crawl down on the floor underneath a
Oh, I
tarpaulin.
read about this. I read about this in a
Or you had
retrospective. Yeah.
to go behind a curtain to. And he was making this point that, what we see, we become so accustomed to, however awful it is.
Yeah.
And so we have to not see them in order to bring it back to our mind that it is awful and we should be seeing it. And he produced a whole series of those. He had some photographs of rioting in Belfast when the Troubles were on. And then the last ones that he did was Twyford Down, which was a big protest, which your older listeners will remember. There was a bypass built around Winchester, and it was a huge cutting through the chalk escarpment and through sites of special scientific interest, and it was huge protests and so on. And actually, he got hold of one of the caterpillar tracks from one of the bulldozers and brought it into the gallery and put it in front of and on top of a picture of the Twyford Down road being built. So another example really of sort of intense creativity, but in a way that's completely unexpected and is making a point. And from my point of view, my practice, I'm always keen. I want something to be aesthetically pleasing, but there's no point in it if it's not actually also, if the viewer wants to, making some sort of point. And that's what he was doing. So sort of, and then I'm jumping.
Yeah, of course.
I know what I wanted to do, if I may.
Yes.
I wanted to quote to you the first paragraph of his 19th essay on damaged nature, if I may. It's so first we had nature, and then came the environment. Environment is the smoke humanity has put on nature. The people who use Latin had no word for environment, they only knew natura. There is an urgent need to redefine notions of nature and environment. The term environment has been hijacked by the forces that are manipulating the world. When Mr. Bill Clinton states that he would be the first environmental president, what can this mean? Anything and nothing. The term environment lends itself perfectly to telling lies and giving illusions. The people who run production and distribution, the controllers of media and government, local and national, are systematically using the term environment to hide realities, confuse the public, and distort their perceptions of reality. This is being done from the basest of motives, to maintain profits and power. The term nature is dropped and replaced by environment. Excellent. And yeah, sort of scientific terminology is used to disguise things, isn't it? And to sort of turn people away from what's really going on. So yeah.
Repackage it as a new problem, a different.
So as I say, I think from the mid-90s onwards, he was definitely a bit of an eco warrior as well
Yeah,
as
I think it's come across to me. It's like a different kind of war for him.
Yeah.
And I think that leads us on really beautifully to the work you touched on very quickly at the beginning of this conversation, which is Remember Nature. And I would love you to tell the listeners what this.
So his last public artwork was on the 4th of November 2015. He called for all creatives to remember nature and called for there to be a day of action for artists to remember nature every year. And the Serpentine Gallery was involved, but he actually did the action in several art colleges. He personally was in Central St Martin's in London, but I know Canterbury School of Art and some others also did it. And he did which he always did. He always used newspapers extensively in his work, and he made, or at least the students made, he was in a wheelchair by this time, made a huge wall of newspaper cuttings relating to nature in one way or another. And they spent the whole day doing it. And I think if you go onto the Central St Martin's websites, tucked away, if you put in Day of Action Remember Nature, you'll find one from me, but you'll also find the original one from him on there with some video, which is quite good. So as I say, I really became aware of the extent of his work and the nature of his work when I read his obituary. And I read it in March of 2017. So I decided that I would organise a Day of Action to Remember Nature, which I did at Islington Mill in Salford on the 4th of November 2017. And we then had a follow-up exhibition of work, most of it not work which was going to last very long. I made my first deliberately auto-destructive work. I put up 12 panels in the courtyard at Islington Mill outside with a picture of a species on the IUCN's red list of endangered species. And then I hung in front of them a piece of modern equipment scavenged from the streets, a laptop, and I think one of them was an old chair, and sort of hanging in front of them. And I also then poured, I had a little strand of work I was doing on domestic pollutants. So I poured a shampoo onto, another one I poured creosote for garden fences, another one sort of different things that we have in the house which are pollutants, and left them for 6 months and then took them down. And by the end of the 6 months, there wasn't much left of the pictures underneath because the wind had blown the things against them and they'd faded as well. But generally speaking, what was still there was our bits of detritus that were sort of so that was my first deliberately auto-destructive art piece. And I decided in practical terms, doing it every year is quite difficult. So I decided I would do it properly every 2 years. So the second one I did, I was doing my master's at Central St Martin's, which is where he was for the first of them. So I got quite a lot of students doing different things, performances. We had people running workshops. We had a local school came and they'd prepared some work and so on. And one of the interesting things I had to fight quite hard to get permission to use the street because some academic had booked it, you see. And the system said that the academics had precedence over students. And so I went to the head of college and said, look,
for you.
And the academic was moved to the far end and we got the near end, so that was good. And then in 2019, I was a long-standing friend from environmental work, Richard Sharland, has a gallery near Launceston in Cornwall, and we co-created a show to coincide with COP26 in Glasgow. And so I was down there and I put out a call to local artists, and about 5 came together, and we made a background, a landscape background, and then we laid it out in the town square for a day and invited passers-by to paint animals, birds, trees, whatever they wanted to of nature on it. And by the end of the day, it was quite full. And then we dipped a bicycle into black paint and rode over it. And then I paddled in my boots in this black ink and then walked over it. And that was to show, the destruction of nature. And then a couple of these local artists talked the local library, public library, into having that displayed in the library where it stayed for several weeks. So that was a good one. And I've just done one. I just did one at the Whitaker in Rossendale. Had a Day of Action to Remember Nature there. We had various activities going on. We showed a film which was about climate change and social justice. There were a couple of workshops. And again, I put a call out and a very nice local artist, Steve Brown, came forward, and we made a 7-meter banner and it's a rainbow banner, so it has the colours of the spectrum. And we think 60 or 70 people all printed nature onto it, leaves or hands or whatever they wanted to onto this. And actually, day after tomorrow, it's going to go and be hung up outside the Whitaker Gallery for a few weeks. Yeah.
Oh, congratulations, that's so exciting.
Yeah. But the common theme of all of them is that they're co-created. You know, I invite other artists to take part, and they're they're completed by others, not just the artist. And what is produced is relatively ephemeral. So
I think it's incredible. And I know that Gustav there's a foundation in his name. Do you submit what you do to the foundations and let them know that you're sort of carrying
I don't really. I just get on with it. I did early on. I tried to see the Serpentine, but no one seemed terribly interested. And and somebody else tried to claim they had copyright over the call for action and so on. So I've used it. So they may have copyright, but
I think that completely goes against what Gustav stands for.
Exactly. But there is. I do know, and I've never been. I should go. His house has become a sort of museum to Metzger, and I ought to go. I believe so. I don't know. That was being worked on before lockdown. I must follow it up actually.
Yeah. Oh well, I would tell you what. If it's a thing people can visit, I'll leave it in a link in the show notes as well.
Okay, brilliant. And then maybe I'll go and visit that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he was active in East London. That's where he lived for years and years and years. And he's buried in Highgate Cemetery.
Yeah.
It's a very famous cemetery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think he's incredible, and what a really powerful message to leave behind. And I feel like as a practice, I find it very interesting because when I was reading about him, there was quite a lot of things on very big commercially driven galleries that showed some of his paintings. Tate had a retrospective, Serpentine had a retrospective. But I think it just shows that there's definitely power in his messages. And as we said previously, he was so forward thinking, and what an incredible.
I know, and I think all the paintings are from very early in his career.
They are very early
in the 50s, when he was with Blumberg and he was doing these, and he abandoned all of that, and sort of and for me, so I'm planning so I've been working on Lindo Moss. Have you heard of Lindo Man? He was a bog body. He's in the British Museum, the best preserved bog body that has been found in the UK. And the anniversary of his 40th anniversary of his finding is next August. But more importantly, in some ways, the peat cutting on the bog, some local activists managed to get stopped about 4 or 5 years ago. And quite a complicated deal was done to buy out the rights to the peat. And the restoration of the bog started in February a year ago. And I was really interested in that because it's sort of transition between 2,000 years of humans degrading the bog, not consistently, and much faster in the last few decades, and potentially the bog becoming a living being, a living ecosystem again. And as you're probably aware, they've only recently discovered just how important peat bogs are in terms of, if they're healthy, they hold vast amounts of carbon and they take it out of the atmosphere and hold it. But if they're dried out and the peat is decomposing, they put it all back into the atmosphere again. So for me, I was really attracted to that. And I did a piece of work last year and then managed to get it shown in an adult education centre nearby the Wilmslow Guilds. And on the back of that, I encouraged, I mean, to be fair, they didn't take that much encouragement, but I put a paper together, and quite a lot of different organisations are taking part in a Lindo season from the summer solstice till the winter solstice next year, so 6 months. And John Hanley's organising a lecture series about the history and the natural history and so on. There's the adult education classes, many of them are taking Lindo as a theme for their textiles or their ceramics or whatever this year. We're hoping that I think it's probably going to happen, the local cinema is going to run a bog-related film festival. and so on. And I'm, as part of this, I'm organising a 6-month outdoor exhibition on the bog itself. And I've got 4 of the local primary schools, possibly 5, keen in helping me to make an artwork to go on the bog. Potentially 700 young people might each do a bit of this artwork.
Amazing,
which is fantastic, but a bit scary. And I'm currently trying to work out how to get 700 plus pieces of canvas cut the right size so that
everyone has the same thing.
And the high school is probably going to get involved in making another work. And I've got a couple of other. I've got willow sculptor is going to do one, and a wood carver is going to do one, and then I'm going to have a number of pieces, all of which relate to the relationship between lindo moss and the environment and the climate and so on. That I've going to put up a piece which is 300 meters long. I've been working on how to do it. I think I've got the answer, but when I first heard a talk about the bog, they said that before it formed, there was 300 meters of ice on top of the bog. So last ice age, the Pennines had 300, and Cheshire, and then they think it formed because a large chunk of ice didn't melt, but the ice around it did. So the land lifted up, and where there was still a block of ice, it made this depression, which allows the raised bogs. Raised bogs need a depression. They're fed only by rain, not by a stream. And I just thought, that's amazing. We walk around here every day and we never think about 300 meters of ice. It's only a mile from Manchester Airport, so I can't fly kites or anything like that. So it's going to be a horizontal 300 meters. And I'm going to ask people to imagine that went that way, So, but anyway, so I'm planning that. I'm busy. But the other attraction of it all is that it'll be out there for 6 months, and then. As Metzger said, it'll be carted away, when it's done with.
That's it, and not for sale as well, which is great. And it's not hidden away. You can happen upon it. You can, if you want to walk on the line, you can, and
exactly
leave your own impression. Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love that Metzger's ethos runs through your personal practice.
Yeah. It just fits.
Yeah,
my philosophy, and it's very. In my practice, really what I'm interested, when I was working in the environment, I found that most people understood the environment they could touch or see. So they understood tree planting, they understood litter, they understood graffiti, but they found it really, really hard to understand either that which is happening on the other side of the world so they can't see it, or that which is invisible, like air pollution or even a lot of pollution of rivers and so on. And so I'm really interested in using what we know scientifically about what's happening as a result of our actions and trying to make it visible, but not in a way that's too didactic. A bit like Metzger. I mean, it is didactic if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. Hopefully it's aesthetic and as well as And I just if I can find it, there's just one other quote I wanted to read you. Yeah, this is from the obituary that I read, and this is sort of maybe what first caught my attention. So the author, who was not sure, I haven't printed it out, but anyway, the author, you'll find it, Guardian, Gustave Metzger obituary, it comes up. Extinction was a subject he returned to many times. A little over a year ago, this was in March 2017, he made a call for a day of action to remember nature and to take a stand, and then quotes, against the ongoing erasure of species. Even where there is little chance of ultimate success, it is our privilege and our duty to be at the forefront of the struggle. There is no choice but to follow the path of ethics into aesthetics. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, honestly, Phil, thank you so much. I have loved reading about Metzger. I have loved speaking to you about him. Thank you. Honestly, thank you. What an artist. And I can't believe I'm only now just coming across it. And I've learned lots, so I definitely know my listeners as well.
Thank you for the opportunity. As you can tell, I'm very much enthused by him and feel he's woefully underappreciated.
I would agree with you. So before you go, where can people connect with you and find you?
Right. So I on Instagram at Phil B XYZ. I have a website which is https:// philbartonartist.c4cp.net. But if you put Phil Barton Artist into most search engines, I think it comes up. And you'll find on there are 3 websites together. It's my partner, my civil partner, my life partner, and I. She has one, which is called the Centre for Connected Practice, hence C4CP. I have one called Phil Barton Artist, and there's one in the middle, which is called Creative Rusholme, which is the work we do in the community of Rusholme in Manchester, where we live. So you'll find, and some of my work appears on both the other websites and vice versa. So, yeah.
Well, I'll leave links in the show notes as well.
So yeah, those are the 2 easiest ways to get to me, and you can direct mail me on Instagram if you want to. And yeah.
So I don't know if you've listened to any of the podcast episodes before. It's not mandatory, so please don't worry if you haven't.
I listened to one to see what I was letting myself into.
Okay. Hopefully it's not been as scary as what you thought it was. But I try and remember to ask all my guests one question. And it's a bit of a mean one. And you can take it as large or as small and specific to you as you want it to be. But my question is, why is art important?
It's important to me personally because I think creativity is a really important part of I always did it. It was sometimes in the margins, but looking back, I realized that quite a lot of my work and projects were creative. They were probably artworks. Joseph Beuys talked about social sculpture, and I think I've done a lot of social sculpture in my time. But I also think it's important in this instance because artists can both say things and express things in very different ways to the way politicians or business or scientists or even a lot of academics do say them and do. And so I just think that, as Metzger said, we have a responsibility as creatives to use our to encourage everyone to remember nature. And if you look at how creative nature is, and nature doesn't bother about what anyone's called or where they've exhibited or how much their artworks are selling for. They just do it because it's creative and it matters and it's important, and that's what I think.
Oh, amazing. I love it. Phil, thank you so much. I've loved having you on. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please make sure to like, rate and subscribe. It does really help in letting other people find us. You can listen to Jo's Art History podcast on any streaming platform, and you can also watch it in a video format on YouTube. If you would like to support the podcast in any way, I have now released an Amazon wish list, which you can also find in the show notes below. This will allow you to donate in part or purchase in full an art historical text that is of interest to me and that will help in research towards future episodes. And it would be really wonderful if you've listened to quite a lot of these, if you could buy that as a way of marking patronage towards the podcast. That would be brilliant. If you would like to get in touch, please do. It's always lovely to hear from people. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with me via Instagram, which is @joesarthistory, or you can search for my name, Jo McLaughlin, via Instagram, and you will find me there. That's all we have from the podcast this week. Thank you so much for listening. Once again, I'll remind you to keep learning and remember, art is for all. Bye.